We're also glad to have Steve Vogel here. He's the author of Through the Perilous Fight, an account of the Chesapeake campaign during the War of 1812, published by Random House in May 2013. He is a reporter for the Washington Post, covering military affairs and veterans. Vogel covered the war in Iraq and the First Gulf War, as well as the U.S. military operations in Rwanda, Somalia, and the Balkans. He is also author of The Pentagon, A History. A graduate of the College of William and Mary, he received a master's degree in international public policy from Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks very much. Great honor to be here following those two terrific presentations. I'm particularly glad to be here because I picked up my son Donald, who I want to note is actually wearing Washington Redskins jersey here. I told him there were going to be a lot of Ravens fans here, but he didn't blink an eye. The car did not start after we tried to leave the soccer clinic where we were. It took two jump starts to get here, but we made it. Also wanted to point out, since there are Ravens fans here, the Ravens were involved in the Defense of Baltimore, little known fact. So, my reading is going to be from the prelude of the book, which sort of sets the stage for the book, introduces one of the main characters, British Rear Admiral George Cockburn. There was a little bit of dispute on how to pronounce his name. Admiral Cockburn always pronounced it Cockburn, but the Americans pronounced it Cockburn, much to his irritation. But I'm going to stick with the British pronunciation. Also wanted to apologize because there's some dialogue here involving Admiral Cockburn and other British sailors. I'm not able to do a very good British accent. I was listening to the book on tape on the way up to see if I could mimic it, and decided I couldn't. I thought about doing a lip sync and decided that wasn't going to work, so we'll just have to stick with the American accent here. The prelude is called I See Nothing Else Left, set on the Potomac River, Tuesday, August 9th, 1814. Sailing under a white flag of truce, American agent John Stuart Skinner rounded Point Lookout and entered the broad mouth of the Potomac River, searching for the enemy fleet. The river was at its widest here, 3 miles from shore to shore, where its water flowed lazily into the Chesapeake Bay. The sultry August weather had turned cool overnight, and the day was refreshingly crisp. Even from a distance, it was easy to spot HMS Albion, anchored along the far Virginia shore. The 74-gun frigate, weighing almost 1,700 tons and manned by a crew of 620, was one of the largest and most powerful British warships ever seen in these waters. More daunting than the ships and weaponry was the man the agent had come to see, Rear Admiral George Cockburn. The Great Bandit, as the papers called him, was the most hated man in the United States and the most feared. Americans compared him to the notorious barbarians of ancient times, among them Attila the Hun. For more than a year, the British squadron commander had waged a campaign of terror along the Chesapeake Bay, sacking Havre de Grace at the mouth of the Susquehanna, ravaging Hampton, plundering the Virginia shoreline, and torching farms in Maryland, acts that had infuriated Americans. Ruthless, witty, and swashbuckling, the Lowland Scot was determined to make Americans pay a hard price for their ill-considered war with Great Britain. There breathes not in any quarter of the globe a more savage monster than this same British admiral, the Boston Gazette declared. He is a disgrace to England and to human nature. A 4th of July celebration in Talbot County, Maryland, included a toast to Cockburn, a man in person but a brute in principle. May the Chesapeake be his watery grave. One irate Virginian had offered $1,000 for the admiral's head or $500 for each of his ears on delivery. Skinner had sailed from Baltimore on August 7th, 1814, bearing official dispatches for the British. As the government's designated prisoner of war agent, Skinner was a veteran of many such missions, routinely carrying communications from Washington or negotiating prisoner exchanges. He was as familiar as anyone in America with Coburn and his depredations. Just 3 weeks earlier, the British had burned the Maryland plantation in Prince Frederick, where Skinner had been born, and earlier in the summer they had torched his barn. But if he held a grudge, Skinner was too savvy to make it known to Coburn. As usual, Skinner was courteously welcomed aboard Albion. For all of Coburn's haughty bombast and undisputed ruthlessness, Skinner had found him to be a gracious host, always seating Skinner for a meal at the Admiral's table and ready to, quote, mitigate the rigors of war with hospitality. Skinner had a rough and tumble personality to match his pugilistic face, as well as an innate candor, all of which Coburn appreciated. The Admiral, his Scottish complexion reddened by the relentless Chesapeake sun, was in a good mood, having just completed a series of successful raids that had terrified residents along the Potomac shores of Virginia's northern neck. At 2 a.m. on August 3rd, Coburn had headed up the Potomac River, probing the inlet off Potomac with a force of 500 sailors and Royal Marines. Among them, dressed in red coats, were a special company of 120 colonial Marines, slaves who had escaped to the British from plantations in Virginia and Maryland and had been trained to fight their former masters. Their use was a particularly brilliant and insidious stroke, unleashing deep-seated fears among the locals of a slave revolt. A Virginia militia company fired on the British with 6-pounder cannons, and the first shot beheaded a Royal Marine. But the Virginians soon ran low on ammunition, and the British swarmed ashore. Major Pemberton Claughton, a Virginia militia commander, was shocked to see a slave who had escaped from one of the plantations among the invaders. The Admiral and the gallant band chased the retreating Americans 10 miles, almost at a run, burning every house they passed, including Major Claughton's home. Finally, the raiding party collapsed on the ground, exhausted in the 90-degree heat. But there was no time for rest. Coburn learned that the Virginia militia was regrouping at the nearby village of Kinsale. "What? Englishmen tired with a fine morning's walk like this," cried Coburn. "Here, give me your musket. Here, yours, my man. Your admiral will carry them for you." He placed a musket on each shoulder and began marching. Returning to the boats, the British sailed to Kinsale, opened fire on the town, and scattered the militia. The village was burned and some 30 homes destroyed. A dead Virginia militiaman was dragged out, his pockets turned inside out. The British carried off 5 captured schooners brimming with hogshead of tobacco. Spreading fear was Coburn's mission, and the sack of Kinsale had served this goal quite well. Back on the ships, Coburn was even more pleased by the news brought to him by 2 British frigates, freshly arrived in the Potomac. Troop ships carrying 4,000 battle-hardened British Army soldiers would soon sail into the Chesapeake. "I suppose some grand attack will be meditated," wrote one of the captains in Coburn's squadron. A grand attack was precisely what Coburn had in mind. 3 weeks earlier, Coburn had submitted a secret plan to capture the capital of the United States. All he needed were Army troops that he could bring up the Patuxent River, a Maryland tributary of the Chesapeake, providing a back route to Washington. Within 48 hours after arrival in the Patuxent, the city of Washington might be possessed without difficulty of any kind, Coburn had written. The British invasion of the Chesapeake was meant to force the United States to divert troops that it had sent to attack British colonies in Canada. But Coburn saw the possibility of more. The fall of the American capital could be the strategic blow that brought Britain victory. The government of James Madison, or Jemmy, as Coburn contemptuously called the 5'4" president, would be scattered in disgrace and perhaps even fall. Quote, "It is quite impossible for any country to be in a more unfit state for war than this now is," wrote Coburn. "Even if the Americans learned every detail of the British plan of attack," Coburn added, "they were too weak to avert the blow." Now in its 3rd year, America's war with Great Britain was about to take a dangerous turn for the United States. The War of 1812 was the outgrowth of the titanic struggle that had raged between England and France almost continuously since 1793. The conflict had only grown more desperate with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte as Emperor of France and his dominance over much of Europe by 1811. Fighting in their mind for England's survival, and even the survival of civilization, the British never hesitated to trample on American sovereignty. They seized American sailors of suspected British origin to man Royal Navy ships, and they severely restricted U.S. trade with Europe. One generation removed from the Revolutionary War, the United States seethed with resentment against her former colonial master. For many Americans in 1812, the belief was strong that the revolution was not complete, that the United States had won its freedom but not its independence. Bowing to the arrogant British behavior would leave Americans, quote, not an independent people but colonists and vassals, President Madison believed. Already fighting a war in Europe, Britain had not sought the conflict with America, but it had no interest in allowing the United States unfettered sovereignty, nor did it wish to cede any measure of control in North America. The Americans and Loyalists who had moved across into Canadian territory after the American Revolution had competing visions for the future of the North American continent, neither involving the other. The American war against one of the world's great powers had gone badly from the start for the United States. Multiple invasions of Upper and Lower Canada, the British colonies, had ended in humiliating failure in 1812 and 1813. Now, driven by events across the ocean, 1814 was shaping up to be the darkest year in the young nation's history. Napoleon's abdication of power in April appeared to have ended 2 decades of hostilities in Europe. The British had been left in a commanding position to end the festering war in North America. Troops from the Duke of Wellington's victorious army were being sent across the ocean to punish America for its treachery and to force a humiliating peace on the country. The United States, its military forces spread thin, its economy in ruins, and its people bitterly divided by the war, was ripe for defeat. The American experiment was in danger of dying in its infancy. Walking the deck of Albion, Coburn chatted amiably with John Skinner. Coburn handed the American agent a dispatch for Secretary of State James Monroe. As a courtesy, he also passed along a bundle of the latest English newspapers, though the latest was more than 2 months old. Skinner brought Coburn news of severe fighting in July on the Niagara frontier between the United States and Canada, where American and British armies at Chippewa and Lundy's Lane had clashed in the bloodiest battles the war had yet seen. They spoke about peace negotiations in the Flemish city of Ghent, where ministers from the United States and Britain had just convened. Few held much hope for peace. The Admiral posed a question to Skinner. What did the American ministers think of the prospects for peace? Skinner replied that there had been no recent word from them. Coburn could not resist smiling as he replied. The Admiral was well aware that his words would soon make their way back to Washington and almost certainly to the President himself. I believe, Mr. Skinner, that Mr. Madison will have to put on his armor and fight it out, Coburn said. I see nothing else left. Thank you.